Hey class, so in this video I'm going to talk about Aperture. I talked a little bit about Aperture in the intro video, and in this one I'm just going to clarify a little bit and I'm going to go over what your assignment for Aperture is. So first I want to talk about how Aperture is measured. Aperture is measured in what we call f-stops. Now without getting too technical, there's an easy way to explain it. Just like shutter speed, Aperture is measured in fractions. It'll be represented as f over whatever number, from lower, something like 1.4, to higher, something like 22. The lower the number, the wider the aperture, and the higher the number, the more closed down the aperture. The reason that is, and an easy way to think about it, is thinking of f, the number on top of that fraction, as the amount of light that your eye can let in. The human eye can let in a lot of light. So if you think of it like a fraction with a constant amount of light on top over a denominator, which will cut that light by that amount, you can start to understand why a higher number is going to be less. So f22, or 1 over 22, is going to be less than 1 over 2, which is just half. So f-stops are broken up into stops. That's why they're called stops. And those stops are a little bit confusing. I'm going to put a chart on there for you, but essentially what each stop is it represents halving or doubling the amount of light. So each stop more closed is half as much light as the stop before. So f2 is twice the amount of light of f2.8, and f2.8 is twice the amount of light of f4. This is helpful when referencing your meter. So if the meter on your camera is saying that you are underexposed by one stop, that means that you would want to go from f4 to f2.8 in order to make up that one stop of exposure. So the main purpose of Aperture is controlling exposure, being able to open up or close down your lens to control light. But there are two other functions and effects that Aperture creates. The first is sharpness. So many lenses, especially old film lenses like this one, were not very sharp at their widest and most open aperture. So one of the effects of stopping down the lens is to increase the detail and the resolution out of that lens. If you find that your pictures are coming out soft, even though you know that the lens is in focus, you should try stopping down the aperture, and that should increase the sharpness very quickly. I'll show an example of this lens at its widest aperture of 1.4, and then this same lens with the same focus at 2.8, and you can see the amount of sharpness that you get just by stopping down a little bit. The other important feature of Aperture is what's called depth of field, and what that means is it's the amount of your image that's in focus based on where the lens is focused. So when you're shooting with a wider aperture, your focus is much shallower, meaning that only a very small portion of that frame is going to be in focus. And likewise, when you're shooting with a stop-down aperture like f8 or f11 or f16, you have a much wider range that you can shoot in and still have your photo be in focus. This is one of the reasons why we're doing the technical exercise that we're doing. You'll be able to see the change in depth of field as you change the aperture. So before I move over into the demonstration for the Aperture project, there are a couple things that you need to know first about the project that I'm expecting you guys to do. The first one is to write down all of your settings. So when you go to take a picture, I want you to write down the shutter speed, I want you to write down the ISO, and I want you to write down the aperture setting for every shot that you take. And when you post those images online, I want you to write those settings down, or you can make the title of the image on your site those settings. Either one is fine. Next, if at all possible, I want you to be manually focusing your images. Some cameras may not give you the option to manually focus, but most DSLRs and many other cameras do have a manual focus option. This will make it a lot easier for you by just putting your camera on the subject and just keeping that focus exactly there. Also, if you don't have one, and you're willing to spend just a little bit of money in this class, I highly recommend you buy a tripod. If you don't get anything else, I highly recommend a tripod. It will help you out tons. And last, I want you to be only using full aperture stops. So between apertures like 1.4 and 2.8 and 4, there are actually more stops in between. Those can be measured in third stops, or they can be measured in half stops. But for this assignment, I want you to only be working in full stops. So with that said, I'm going to give you a different camera angle and I'm going to hop over into the assignment. Alright, so here's what I've got set up over here. I've got my camera right here and I've got a little monitor on it so I can give you a little overlay of what my settings are. And here, my subjects. I've got my camera right here, that's going to be my main subject. And I have a little car in the front just to have a little bit of foreground, and a picture in the back, and back here we've got some blankets. So we have some kind of objects in front of and behind our subject so that we can really see the effects of focus and depth of field that Aperture has. So here I've got my camera set into manual mode. I can zoom in and I can make sure that I'm focused on that camera. Perfect. So I'm looking here at my meter. My meter right now is saying that I'm 1/3 stop underexposed. So I'm going to change. So there is. All right. So with these settings right here, I'm at f4, I'm at 1/4 of a second, and my meter is right in the middle. That's perfect. So I'm going to take this photo. And that's looking really good. So next, I want to underexpose by 1 stop. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to stop my aperture down to f5.6, which is the next whole stop. And you can see that my meter is -1. So I'm going to take that image. And now next, I want to overexpose by 1 stop with my aperture. So I'm going to stop back down to 4 and then keep on going to 2.8. Now it's telling, my meter is telling me that I'm plus 1.3, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to go with the full stop. So there we go. Now we have one overexposed photograph. And the reason I'm not worrying about what the meter is saying is because I know that f2.8 is 1 stop more light than f4. So I'm just making sure that all of my aperture stops are in whole stops. So let's go back to our normal exposure. Awesome. And we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to adjust our aperture up and down 1 stop, but we're going to compensate the exposure with our shutter speed. So we're going to take our normal photo, just like last time. Great. Now we want to move our aperture up so that we're -1 stop, so back to f5.6. And then we want to change our shutter speed, which is at 1/4 of a second right now. We want to make it a little bit slower to 1/2 of a second so that we can still have our exposure meter read at 0. So we're going to take that exposure. Awesome. And we're going to do the opposite. So we're going to move our aperture down past 4 and all the way down to 2.8. And then we're going to move our shutter speed past 1/4. We're going to go all the way to 1/8 of a second. So we're making it 1 stop faster in the shutter speed. Awesome. All right, guys, so that's it for this assignment. You just pick a subject where you can see objects in the foreground and behind. Usually, keeping your camera pretty low to the ground helps to accentuate that effect of foreground and background. And you're just gonna take a photo, find your normal exposure, and you're going to take your photo, then you're going to make it 1 stop overexposed by changing the aperture, and 1 stop underexposed by changing the aperture. And then I want you to do the same thing again with your normal photo, and I want you to change the aperture 1 stop closed and 1 stop open, but I want you to compensate the exposure by changing your shutter speed so that all 3 of those exposures have different apertures, but they're all equally exposed. So that's it. I'll see you guys next time, and have a good one.